In this presentation, I'm going to go over what a research question is, or more importantly, what I mean when I say a research question. And I'm going to kind of contrast it to what other people might mean when they say a research question. Now, you got the textbook, Baglioni's writing book about writing papers, and she talks about research questions in a chapter. And to be honest, I do not find this chapter as useful as, say, the chapter on the lit reviews. So I'm going to put a caution flag on it. And she gives six characteristics of good research question. It should be interesting, and that's always an important thing. And I always say it should be interesting to you as a to sustain your efforts in it. It should be important, and that kind of links. We could look at different things, how you might do contrast interesting versus important. And important, I'm going to say, in a lot of ways, relates to whether it's significant in the field of IR and or political science that she's talking about, and is it something that's not trivial, and is it something that affects IR and is likely to happen again is another measure, but is it important? The characteristics, another characteristic, she goes, it should be short and it should be direct, and you should be able to encompass it quickly, and it should be direct, mean clear cut. It should be doable, and this is something that we're going to assess. She talks about it needs to be doable. Have to be able to provide some kind of answer to it. And she also goes, it should be puzzling. The question should in some way, in political science especially, we like it when things are puzzling, right? Why does this occur, right? And if democracies don't go to war and then we see a war between nations, or actually the whole idea of democracies not going to war, why is that? That is itself puzzling. And if we ever had an example of two democracies fighting, that would be puzzling from the point of view of the other. So puzzling is part of, although honestly, isn't that just interesting and important? I don't know. But these are her characteristics, and they're fine. They're fine as a thing. But I want to focus in on a characteristic that differs depending on who we talk to. And here's the thing. If you go out there and look for videos on research questions, as I just did, trying to see if I could find something I could use instead of wasting your time with my stuff, I found that we had a split. Some videos, and there's one from Lund University and George Mason, actually a handout from their writing center, will say that a good research question should be either debatable or arguable, that it should be kind of broad, and you're not going to find a clear-cut, unequivocal answer. You're going to there's going to be some room for judgment, assessment, argument, debate, whatever you will. That makes the question broad, right? Other people in like Scribber, which is professional site talking about writing, and there's a professor from University of Melbourne went out and they kind of said, well, no, not addressing this, but they focused on the idea of whether the question is answerable, right? And this is the key thing. When someone says research question, what do they mean? In my definition of a research question, I fall very heavily on the side of answerable, that the question should be something that can be answered rather unequivocally through empirical or theoretical methods. It should be something that we don't know, but we can go in and a reasonable person, I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna be transparent about the steps I do in coming up with the answer, and at the end of it, you should be convinced that my answer to the question is right, within the criteria that it's laid out in, right? And that is very often the case. Like if you test a hypothesis, with quantifiable methods, that you're setting up a question, you're looking at data, you're going through the steps and coming up with an answer, and that's it's kind of unequivocal. I'm trying not to say objective. We often use the term reliable, reproducible as instead. In science, definitely if you can, one experiment needs to be, you need to be able to reproduce it. But that's unequivocal, right? That's what I'm saying. And that's what I mean by, is it answerable, right? Can we answer this question? And usually that question leads you to a debate, to argue for an answer to a broader research question, what I often call the topic. So I always see the term research question as kind of a sub-question to your overarching topic or research question. Now, others, though, have the research question as the top line, right? And if that's the case, well, yeah, it should be debatable, should be arguable. But this is a big thing, and it comes up, when I give you an assignment telling you to produce a research question at the end of your lit review. But I also think it goes to this nature of a lot of our research where we have nested questions, right? And let's look at a couple examples. Personal example, my dissertation, are international economic sanctions effective? That is an overarching question. It was the topic. It was also the frickin' title. I just put it right there. That's what I'm doing my dissertation on, and I never called it the research question, but in each chapter, I had a specific question, something I looked at that would, lend itself to this answer, because this broad question, this is, are international sanctions effective? Well, that's going to be arguable. That's going to be debatable. For instance, I had many chapters, but in chapter 2, I had a 3-nation model, and the chapter was entitled "The Economic Effects of Interrupting Trade." But the question that was being asked in it is, under what conditions does the interruption of trade by one nation impose costs on another? And in the context of a 3-nation trade model, right? Well, here's a 3-nation trade model, and that I present the model, and and it turns out that there's certain conditions under which if you interrupt trade, nothing happens, and it's conditions in which you cause so there were conditions, right? And that was answerable, and you really couldn't debate the answer. You could argue whether a 3-nation trade model was appropriate. You could argue internally whether I got it right, but in general, if you follow the steps, you should be convinced of that. And then that answer to that question led to, it kind of suggested that the conditions were difficult to achieve, and that, by the way, and that when you did impose costs on the other guy, it meant you were imposing costs on yourself. And guess what? You were benefiting the third party, the uninvolved nation. And then, that insight went into my answer to the overarching question, right? And so here we go. And I didn't really at the time have in my head this, thing. I said, this is my topic, and this is, in this chapter is what I'm doing. But I would say that what I was doing in chapter 2 is the research question for that chapter, right? But it's nested in this broader question of, are sanctions effective? Now, another example that I love to use is from John Mueller's Search for the Breaking Point in Vietnam. Very interesting article, journal article. And his overarching question, what motivated him, was that, Westmoreland had a strategy of attrition, that he was trying to push Vietnam to the breaking point. And as long as they were suffering more casualties in the U.S., he felt he was going for the breaking point. And Mueller, kind of is like, was that a feasible strategy? Were we ever going to get to the break? Did we just need to go farther? What's up with that? And so his overarching one is, was that strategy feasible? Right? You might put it different. I'm summarizing, but basically that's where we go. That's the overarching question. And by the way, that's the kind of thing that the debatable, arguable folks, and in fact, maybe Baglioni, would call the research question. However, what Mueller did in that article is he focused most of the article, the body of the article, although he had a very long conclusion, the body of the article focused on answering the question, how many casualties did the Vietnamese suffer as a percentage of their population? And how did that compare to other nations at war? And so he said, let's look, and a lot of time went into, because there was controversy about that number of casualties the Vietnamese suffered. And Mueller analyzed that, went through the data, the arguments, and came up with a number, calculated a percentage of the population, and said, okay, this is what I think the percentage was. And holy crap, it was huge compared to other nations, because he went and compared it to databases and said, it was a couple times what the Japanese suffered in World War II. And there's only one other nation, small nation, that suffered a genocide that suffered worse. So the Vietnamese were at the top. They suffered more as a percentage of their population than almost everybody else. That was the specific answerable question, something that, you could follow through his logic and say, all right. Then he said, well, that suggests maybe there wasn't a breaking point. And so he went, and in his conclusions, he leveraged this finding that, he's got this answer that the Vietnamese suffered more as a percentage of casualties, as a percentage of their population than anyone else. And he went on to say, well, what did that mean to the strategy, and evaluated, and there his conclusions, and this is what I say, there's a difference between your findings, your empirical findings, and your conclusions in a paper. His conclusions went on for like 10 pages, because he was using that as a point to make some arguments about what might otherwise have happened, or, very interesting. I've never seen anyone get quite so much leverage out of one empirical, finding. But there you go. And so we have, again, nested questions. The broader, interesting, overarching question, and the specific, smaller, answerable question that you can answer. In this case, in my case, I was answering it through theoretical methods, which most of you won't do. Here, it was done by assessing the data and looking at information out there, comparing various data sources and assessing the validity of them, and coming up with an answer, and so on. So this, I would call the specific answerable question his research question, and the overarching question his topic, or just his question. Others will disagree. One last one. I had a student example, because here's, your students. In a methods class, a student, back when John Kerry, this was right after the election, where H. Bush, the second Bush, was reelected. And this student, though, was in the Army, and he just thought that John Kerry's proposal to recruit, I don't know if there was 50,000 or 100,000, I can't recall at the moment, or what the student said he claimed. But the point was, Kerry claimed, he said, all right, I want to recruit more people. And this guy was like, Kerry's full of, this is bull. And he said, this is no way you could do it. And it was really exercised over this. And he wanted to research it. And so, all right. And there we would probably write the question, was John Kerry's proposal feasible? Right? That would probably be the way. But I just like, is John Kerry full of bull? And so the student, well, what do we do with that? Right? How do we answer that question is obviously, and we talked about how we could do it. And I said, well, it's hard to say because it's counterfactual, but what we do is let's look at the past. And, you had the Reagan buildup, and look at the size of the Reagan buildup compared to the population available 18-year-olds at the time, and then take Kerry's thing and see, do the math, which is bigger, right? Reagan did it, and had some negative results in terms of qualifications of people, but we have an example, and so which is longer, which is bigger, and there you go. And I remember, I think this is where I came up with the phrase hard kernel of empirical truth, in that when you looked, and then he went in and he did look, and what he found was that in comparison to the increase in troops during the Reagan buildup in the 80s, what Kerry was proposing was actually relatively modest. I don't recall exactly, it was half and so he is a great example, another example I love of someone coming in and completely changing in their mind through their own research, which is the hallmark of well done research. Um, and the student, was like, oh, all right. And he said, well, maybe Kerry wasn't full of bullducky. And there you go. That, and again, I called it the research question as opposed to his overarching motivating question or whatever. I also called what he found the hard kernel of empirical truth, right? That his comparison is, you could double check it, and he laid it out, and I thought he did a good job on it. And you could check it for kind of its internal. Uh, we have validity and reliability questions in there, but did it internally hold together? And the comparison, if he does it correctly and writes it up, and okay, and it seemed pretty clear that it was, the Reagan growth was bigger, right? And hard to argue with that. But what's the conclusion, right? Well, the conclusion that he drew is that, well, maybe Kerry wasn't as full of, it could have been done. Note, this is after, this is when Iraq is going on. And there's a story here. That's why I tell this story. Later on, I saw him, months later, and this was when the Army was having all sorts of trouble making its recruiting goals. And he said, well, I guess, we didn't expand, and we're having trouble making the original one. So I guess my conclusion was was wrong. And I said, well, yes and no. You still have that hard kernel of empirical truth that, hey, this buildup that Kerry wanted was smaller. Reagan was able to build up. And I said this kind of contextualizes, the fact that you not only can't build up, but that you're having as much trouble recruiting. It kind of makes a point about, how difficult this is, right? And I said that finding, that empirical finding, the answer to the research question still exists. And, it's this I call it the hard kernel of empirical truth. I keep saying it, but it's this thing, this called a factoid if you want, but it's this factual finding that can be used in other debates to answer other questions. For instance, if you read the Mueller article, you will forever know something about Vietnam, right? That, wow, they suffered more casualties as a percentage of the population than practically anyone. Many, like double what there's, however many times what the Japanese did. That factoid, that or a better way to, that empirical finding comes in useful if and I if someone says, oh, we're gonna follow the Vietnamese strategy to break the United States. I'm like, oh, really? Are you? And I remember during the occupation, people were talking about, are we going to do, we can do what Vietnam did. Al Qaeda we can do what Vietnam did to these guys. It's like, really, are you? You're really going to be able to do that? Because most nations can't. Because it's more, it is that finding. Hey, it's more a percent as a percentage of the population is more than anyone's ever suffered. You really want to take on the United States? Seriously, guys. So I'm just saying, and you can disagree with that, but the point is that finding is useful. So what I'm trying to get at was we have this nesting. And so I like to call the smaller, the empirical question, the thing you research, the research question, because the other thing is just the question. Some people are on board with that, other people not so much. Regardless, the point is we have nested questions, right? And nested questions. I've said it a few times now. But we have some overall question, topic is broader and debatable. Then we have a specific question, an answerable one. I call it the research question. And the answerable question that provides a basis for supporting an answer to the overall question, and as I say, provides a hard kernel of empirical truth. Don't use that. That's kind of like just me. That's kind of a colloquial, hyperbolic thing. Don't use that with other people. Although I do like the what it represents. And the big point here is that we have these nested questions, that you will have a question about the world. And then you will probably have, whether you're doing in a research project or anything you do, there will be an overarching question with broader ramifications that you're looking for, and it'll be more debatable, right? Then there'll be something that you look at, the specific, what I call research question, which is defined in a way that can be answered by looking at information, facts, data, observations, whatever the method is that can provide an unequivocal answer that you can lay out and say, here's the answer, right? And then you use that answer to infer a conclusion to the overarching question, right? That's important. And so when I say research question, I'm talking about the specific thing. In, say, like the literature review assignment, I'm asking you kind of for both of these things. I'm saying, okay, what is a overarching, what is the avenue of future research or the opportunity? And there I'm really asking for this overall question or topic. And then I'm saying also it'd be nice to have a specific research question. What would you look at to answer? What could you possibly do to answer that broader question? And so those are my definitions, and that's what I'm talking about. But I also think this is a very important conceptual thing, to have this in your head, that this is how research gets done, and this is what you'll need to do when doing a paper. You'll have some broader question, and you'll have to find some angle, some answerable question, doable thing that will provide support for a broader, more debatable, arguable answer. Bottom line, whatever you call them, most research in here consists of specific answerable questions nested in or larger questions or topics. And I'm going to call the specific answerable question research questions. Keep in mind, Baglioni certainly doesn't. And this comes up, by the way, when she talks about your literature review, and she says you're starting with a research question and you're looking up the answers to it. Whereas I'm like, well, you're starting with kind of a topic and then you're seeking more specific questions that you can answer. We have a differing point of view, right? And so her use of research question is different than mine. And you're going to want to keep that in mind when you read the chapter on the literature review, and try to figure out, bounce it against what I'm asking you to do in the assignment. But this is what I wanted to get across. Important safety tip about what I mean by research question, but more importantly, I do think this is a valuable concept to have in mind, that we do this nesting, that we are answering smaller questions to get at answers or arguments about answers to bigger ones.